Hello, everyone, and welcome to my memory palace on the book of Hebrews. I have chosen the scene of the Last Supper because there were 13 people at the Last Supper, and there are 13 chapters in this book. Each slide covers one individual from around the table, which I have used to construct my memory palace. I do hope you enjoy this presentation. The picture I've chosen is of the Nativity. The architectural space is a humble stable built to serve as a residence for animals. There is nothing more beautiful than the birth of God's Son, and Hebrews begins with a beautiful prologue which portrays God speaking afresh in His Son. The themes that are brought forward are of God's revelation in the prophets and in His Son. This is visible in the prologue, where the author's usage of Old Testament scripture. Verse 4 provides a clear concept of the supreme name, and the story of Nativity tells us that He was to be named Jesus, for He shall save His people for their sins. The baby's first cry is of utmost importance, and those involved in the birthing process await the sound of the cry. What becomes most evident is that Hebrews involves a lot of noise. God spoke to the fathers, God speaks to the recipients and to the Son, angels spoke, salvation is spoken of by the Lord, hence hearing becomes imperative. The Katina commences from verse 5 and states, "You are my son," which is taken from Psalm 2:7. A look at Joseph additionally reminds me of Christ's Davidic lineage. Mary and Joseph in the scene are representative of angel visitations. The study of angelology becomes visible in this chapter. Verse 6 indicates the angels worship the Son, and what is important to note is the theme running through the verses is the relationship between the Son, angels, and believers. The supremacy of Christ over the angels and being made lower than the angels is portrayed. The architectural space I've chosen is a horticultural one. It is a garden of Gethsemane. Once the author establishes Christ's supremacy over the angels and creation, the author then transitions from the situation of Christ to the situation of the Christians. Chapter 2 adheres the audience to listen and to remain closely attentive to what God has said to them through Christ, or they would be in danger of drifting away or, in short, lose their faith. The disciples in this image are reflective of this. I've often heard the saying, Judas kissed the gate of heaven and went to hell. This scene in which Judas is portrayed is depictive of the dangers of drifting away. Peter is visible in this scene, and as the story in the Garden of Gethsemane goes, Peter is the disciple who brashly cut off the soldier's ear. Peter reminds us to listen. He stresses the importance of hearing, as well as the refusal to do so. We now turn our attention to Jesus in this image. At this point in Hebrews, the author reiterates a passage from Psalm 2, which the audience would have been familiar with, which begins with, "What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him?" The humiliation, suffering, and death of Christ is already apparent in contrast to his exaltation. Rather, it is because of Christ's death that he is exalted. Chapter 1 began with the sonship and his divine role as the all sufficient high priest, which is described in the closing of this chapter. The theme running from chapters 3 and 4 is the faithful and merciful high priest. The scene I've chosen is that of the Transfiguration. Verses 1 through 6 appears to have been constructed in a chiastic form bearing a logic in mind. It provides the identity of the recipients. Both Jesus and Moses are faithful. God built the house through Jesus, who is worthier. Moses is servant in the house, whereas Jesus is the son. To the reader it appears to be a synthesis between Jesus the faithful son and Moses the faithful servant. The author's pastoral concern is visible at the onset of the chapter when he uses the language of kinship such as holy brothers. In verse 6 the audience is addressed as the household of God and are urged to remain unwavering. The first disciple portrays the idea of being holy brothers. The location, that is the Transfiguration, is representative of in verses 7 through 11, which provide a note of caution to the readers. The readers are cautioned about the faithlessness of the wilderness generation. The author draws a comparison between the time the Israelites spent in the wilderness and the situation the readers presently find themselves in. In order to emphasize his points, he cites from Psalm 95. The second disciple in this scene is indicative of this, as he is a descendant of Israel. Elijah in this scene reminds us of the words, "Today, if you hear his voice," which is repeated twice in this chapter. The third disciple represents the promised rest. The Israelites did not enter the rest, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. This chapter continues with the idea of rest. The creation story begins with God resting on the seventh day. One of the Ten Commandments instituted by God and given to Moses pertains to a Sabbath rest. The architectural space I've chosen is of an upper room. The scenario is of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. The disciple in this image portrays an individual resting after a long and difficult journey. The writer of Hebrews moves expertly from exposition to exhortation. The application of Psalm 95 is found in the subsequent verses, which is an exhortation by the author to attain God's rest. The lamp in the room indicates a light to prevent us from falling and ultimately not be able to enter the rest. The water falling from the jar is the word which discerns the condition of our heart, verse 12. The window in this image reminds us that God sees everything, verse 13. We now move to Christ in this image. In the same manner that a priest would ceremoniously wash himself before commencing the process of sacrifice, Jesus is depicted in this image as washing his disciples' feet. Jesus is a well-tested high priest. Verse 15 indicates Christ, the high priest's ability to sympathize with the believer's weaknesses as he was in all points tested, yet without sin. Chapter 4 does not leave the reader hopeless but provides encouragement that is both mercy and grace are available at the throne of grace which can be approached with boldness. This image is of the cobblestone highway to Jerusalem and of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. At the opening of this chapter, the author begins to unpack the role of the high priest. The author puts forward a rhetorical construct of Jesus as high priest. The structure of verses 1 through 10 are chiastic in form, and the donkey in this image brings forward this structure. It provides us with the function, person, and appointment of the high priest, and Christ's role, function, and appointment to this role. Jesus in this image is representative of his calling to high priesthood. He has been called into another branch and perfected through suffering. The author quotes from Psalm 110. Branch 1 represents the first part of the psalm. You are my son, today I have begotten you. And the second branch, visible in this image, is another verse from Psalm 110. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. The scene I've chosen is a boat in a body of water. On board this vehicle of transport are Jesus and his disciples. In the same manner that the boat had to leave the safety of the harbor, the author speaks of leaving elementary doctrine of Christ and indicates the audience is not to lay again foundational doctrines. The flow of the boat is the foundation upon which the disciples rest and represents these foundational doctrines. Verses 4 through 6 are filled with bleakness. The author first utilizes fear, confidence, and then faithfulness to convey his point. As the story goes, a storm brews while the disciples are in the boat. This evokes fear. Jesus then calms the storm, which causes the disciples to marvel and gain confidence in their rabbi, which evokes their faithfulness, as 10 of these disciples willingly laid down their lives for their Christian faith. The author describes desertion in loyalty to Christ in similar terms as crucifying Christ all over again, and Judas portrays this. Verses 6 to 12 encourages the readers to persevere for their homeward journey. The sails of the boat portray that there is hope if we have wind in our sails for our journey homeward. Christ in this image is the sure and steadfast anchor of our soul, our hope, and in whom we can find refuge. Christ's superior status is reiterated, and it introduces him as high priest from the order of Melchizedek, thereby referencing Psalm 110, verse 4. In this architectural space, you see Jesus ordaining his disciples, giving them power and authority over all devils and to cure diseases. In essence, he is not only ordaining them, but making a covenant with them. Jesus is the guarantor of a better covenant, as mentioned in verse 22. Jesus in this image is depictive of his dual roles as king and priest, a forever priest. Verses 4 through 10 draws us to Abraham and Melchizedek, and the disciples in this image are representative of Abraham, since they are his descendants. The event itself reminds me of Christ's character as described in verses 26 through 28, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted. In chapter 8, Philip is explaining to the Ethiopian eunuch the scroll's text, which pertains to Isaiah 53. The scroll is the covenant, whereas Jesus, the context of the scroll, is the minister of the new covenant. The two horses represent the old covenant and the new covenant. Philip and his shadow are representative of the tabernacle in the wilderness, which served as a copy of heavenly things, as mentioned in verse 5, since he was Christ's disciple and experienced the infilling of the Holy Spirit. The Ethiopian reminds me that all know God, as mentioned in verse 11, and of the new law being established, which God will write in the heart of an individual, as mentioned in verse 10. The architectural space I've chosen is at the foot of the cross. This chapter begins with the tabernacle in the wilderness. As described from verses 1 through 10, the stony ground represents the holy place, a sacred place. The cross represents the Holy of Holies. The author describes the holiest place and reaches a climax with an account of the mercy seat. The cross and the ground represents the tabernacle in the wilderness, which provided a sanctuary under the old covenant, even though these were temporary rituals. The ladder is the veil that separated the holy place. Christ is the mediator of the new covenant so that we may receive the promised eternal inheritance as mentioned in verse 15, of which Mary and John are representative of in this image. Christ's blood is indicative of his eternal sacrifice for us and his sacrifice as the Day of Atonement, which is mentioned in verse 14. Christ's lifeless body, his dead body, reminds us that a will comes into effect at death, as mentioned in verse 17, and that his death was once and for all, verse 26. I've selected another sea vessel. Visible in this scene are the disciples with Christ and Peter walking on the water. The opening verse of this chapter indicates that the law is the boat. The law and repeated sacrifices could not make perfect, that is, take the worshipper to the very presence of God. As Christ approached the boat, in the same manner Christ came to fulfill God's ultimate plan of salvation, verses 7 and 9. Christ is the enthroned high priest, verses 11 to 18. The author moves from exposition to exhortation. Peter reminds me that we must hold fast to the confession of our faith without wavering, verse 23, because he who promised is faithful. The author exhorts the audience to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. This is representative of the disciples who decided to spend time together doing what they do best. The architectural setting is of a room, and in this room are Thomas, the disciples, and Christ post-resurrection. Chapter 11 is known as Faith's Hall of Fame, and the scene with doubting Thomas is reflective of his lack of faith and trust in his friend's word. This chapter covers Israel's faithful men and women even in the unseen future. It includes a quotation from Habakkuk 2:4, which is cited at the end of the chapter in verse 38. The theme that unifies this chapter is faith, and a look at Thomas reminds me of this missing ingredient in his story. Christ in this image is reflective of the fact that we are to have faith in God's promises, which is from verses 8 to 22. The first disciple is reflective of the faith of Moses and the Exodus generation, verses 23 to 31, and the second disciple is reflective of the subsequent generations who lived by faith, verses 32 to 40. Perhaps one of my favorite images is the one of Jesus and the children. I've chosen this one because when I read this chapter, it brings to mind a parent's loving correction as well as encouragement. The people in this picture depict the cloud as mentioned in verse 1. Christ in this image portrays that he is the pioneer as well as perfecter of our faith and the one who has already gone ahead or completed the race. The mother and child are reflective of verses 4 through 11, which speaks about discipline. While it may be painful, it yields much fruit. This is followed by practical implications of living a holy lifestyle, which is portrayed by the tall tree as it grows heavenward. This reminds me that the city of God is a Christian's ultimate goal, as depicted in verses 18 to 24. In the manner in which the people listen intently to Christ, likewise too, the end of this chapter asks us to heed God's voice, verses 25 through 29. The architectural scene I've chosen is of the upper room. Visible are Christ's disciples on the day of Pentecost. This chapter continues from the previous one. It portrays the author's concern for fellowship among the brethren. As the story in this image portrays, the disciples were worshipping together in one accord when the Spirit of God fell profoundly upon them. The author provides ethical injunctions and examples to follow in verses 1 to 8, which is reflective in the stairs in this image. A Christian's character should reflect Christ-likeness. A believer's sacrifice and submission to leaders is reflective in the raised arms of the individuals in this image. The disciples are in the midst of worship and prayer with which the author ends this chapter.